editor. Oh, thank you, Helen. And Helen is recording this webinar for us, so you should have just heard that kick in. Dr. Wei is also editor-in-chief of the Colorado Encyclopedia and a member of the state's Historian Council. He specializes in the histories of modern China, Asian America, and Colorado. And the Colorado Sun selected his Asians in Colorado as one of the 50 best books about the American West. His latest work is Becoming Colorado, the Centennial State in 100 Objects. And he was the 2019-2020 Colorado State Historian and a recipient of the 2022 Asian American Hero of Colorado Award from the Colorado Asian Culture and Education Network. So great credentials for you, Dr. Wei. We're so grateful for you to be with us for this next hour. Participants who are listening in on the webinar, we have a Q&A function, so you're able to ask questions as they come up throughout the presentation, and we'll have time at the end to address those questions with Dr. Wei. So without further ado, Dr. Wei, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Helen, for producing this presentation. Well, I'm delighted to talk to you about Asians in Colorado. It is, well, a timely subject, given the recent rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and the resurgence of white supremacy and American nativism. I want to share with you some statistics, some of which you've already seen. The executive director of the Public Health Institute, Robert Belknap, had sent this information around. As the slide indicates, anti-Asian hate crimes have increased by about 339% from 2020 to the present. And a more important thing to keep in mind is that 1 in 5 physicians and surgeons and 1 in 10 nurses are Asian American Pacific Islanders. Now, the thing to know about the anti-Asian hate crimes is they've been associated with the pandemic that we've been experiencing the last couple of years. Because of the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, the Congress has actually stepped up and provided overwhelming support this time last year to pass, if you will, a COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which President Biden has signed. That basically addresses hate crimes throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, with particular emphasis on the increase in violence against Asian Americans. A year later, the Justice Department announced new initiatives to address and prevent hate crimes and hate incidents. The irony, of course, is the fact that about 10% of the health workers on the front line combating the pandemic are Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders. They bear, if you will, the dual burden of having to fight both racism and the pandemic. Now, look, while COVID-19 originated in China and the Chinese have been blamed for it, the hate crimes have been directed against Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Now, the reason for this is that the APIs have never been fully accepted as Americans. Indeed, they are forever foreigners in their own country. They've been demonized as an invasive species that were considered separate, different, and usually inferior. It is important to know that stereotyping of APIs as disease carriers and scapegoating them for the spread of diseases and engaging in violence against them has been a recurring phenomenon. For example, in the 19th century, Chinese immigrants were blamed for smallpox outbreaks. In the late 19th century, Filipinos were considered incubators of leprosy. In the early 20th century, Japanese were blamed for the bubonic plague. And of course, the Chinese have been blamed for COVID-19. Now, instead of trying to protect APIs, former President Donald Trump frequently used racist phrases such as Kung Flu and Chinese virus to describe the coronavirus. Yeah. And that has, of course, contributed to the increase in anti-Asian attitudes and actions. In addition to the pandemic, actually, what we have is, well, a pandemic of racism in the country. As the experiences of Asians in Colorado shows, the scapegoating and stereotyping of APIs have been part of a pattern that began with their arrival in America and Colorado. The Chinese were the first group of Asian immigrant workers to come to Colorado. They were probably former Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific Railroad, the most difficult and dangerous half of the famous Transcontinental Railroad. Not incidentally, AAPI Heritage Month is, of course, in May, and it was designated May in part because of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the Chinese were hired only when the Central Pacific was unable to find white workers to build the railroad. So the Chinese constituted the vast majority of the laborers. Over 90% of them worked on the Central Pacific, an estimated 15 to 20,000. And an estimated 600 had died and many more were injured. For their pain and suffering, they received wages lower than their white counterparts. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, former California governor and founder of Stanford University, he told Congress in 1865 that the majority of the railroad labor force were Chinese, and without them, he said, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of the great national enterprise that was, of course, the Transcontinental Railroad. In helping to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese immigrants who labored on the Central Pacific and the Irish immigrants who labored on the Union Pacific helped to unify the nation economically, socially, and politically. They, quite frankly, put the United in the United States of America. It is important for our history to be, of course, inclusive, if for no other reason than accuracy, but also to make all Americans a part of the nation's story. I got to tell you a story. My daughter, Leslie, saw the film, This is America, Charlie Brown, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. She smiled when she saw that it included Chinese immigrant workers. At that moment, she realized that Chinese Americans were part of the American story. Ever since I learned about the indispensable role that Chinese railroad workers played in building the Transcontinental Railroad, the song, I've been working on the railroad, has, well, had special meaning for me. I bet when you look at this slide, you'll be able to tell who were the Chinese workers and who wasn't, right? Here is a close-up of the Chinese railroad workers, and they are the ones who were standing with one sitting. Yeah. After being discharged from the railroads, Chinese workers dispersed throughout the American West looking for work. They did so because, well, they needed to make a living and support their families. I want you to know that throughout the West, they performed all manners of labor, usually in low-wage and physically demanding occupations. Many of them engaged in mining and could be found in Colorado, panning for gold, working in the silver mines, toiling in the coal fields. They were part of the labor force that laid the economic foundation of Colorado. By the way, I think I should also mention that we should be extolling the miners rather than the cowboys for their role in making the state economically viable. The role of miners is, as you know, is acknowledged in the state seal, which has two miners' tools, the pick and sledgehammer, crossed on a golden background in the lower half of the shield at the center of the seal. The miner is, well, a much better role model than the much romanticized cowboy, who historically was essentially a gun-toting juvenile delinquent. Here is a slide of, a gang of Chinese workers working on a road project. Here is a shot of the Chinese opening up businesses. And here is a picture of them working in a laundry. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this last slide is that they ended up working in hand laundries, mainly because they were driven out of all the other occupations, the mainstream occupations, and worked in marginal jobs such as laundrymen. I want you to know that whenever you see an ethnic or racial group in a particular line of work, it is because of circumstances rather than a natural preference. In other words, the Chinese are neither racially nor culturally predisposed to washing other people's dirty clothes. On June 29th, 1869, the Colorado Tribune reported the arrival of the first Chinese to Denver. He was identified simply as John Chinaman. He and those who came after him started Denver's Chinatown. Like other immigrant groups, such as the Irish and Italians, the Chinese established an ethnic enclave in Denver where they lived and opened businesses. Chinatown was a place where Chinese throughout the state could come for supplies, rest, and recreation, and a good meal, Chinese food. Denver's Chinatown was a thriving working class community, though it had been stigmatized as a den of iniquity and its Chinese residents as disease-ridden hopheads, hopheads being drug addicts. The Chinese immigrants became a national issue in the 1870s when they were made scapegoats for the nation's economic and social problems. Now, this Thomas Nast cartoon graphically expresses how the public perceived them and how they were treated. Take a close look at this political cartoon. You can see it says the Chinese question. The question is whether they should allow more Chinese immigrants to enter the country. The issue of immigration has been, of course, the perennial one. You can tell from the other words in this cartoon how they were perceived. They were generally perceived as an economic and social threat, and they suffered from harassment, violence, and exclusion. There is, by the way, Lady Columbia protecting the poor benighted Chinese heathen. In the Old West, they coined the expression, not a Chinaman's chance, to describe the plight of the Chinese in Colorado and elsewhere. And by the way, not a Chinaman's chance means no chance at all, because they had no protection under the law. They were victims of a nativist-inspired ethnic cleansing campaigns. Once upon a time in the American West, there were over 200 Chinese communities until they were destroyed and the Chinese were driven out of them. You'd never know that if you travel to the American West, because they've all gone away. One of the worst examples of this type of ethnic cleansing campaign was the infamous Denver anti-Chinese riot that occurred on October 31st, 1880. As the Wilkins drawing illustrates, a mob estimated to be between 3,000 to 5,000 Denverites descended upon Chinatown, raping and pillaging. The rioters were not just having a bad day. They were hell-bent on destroying Chinatown and its people. This was one of the worst anti-Chinese incidents in the American West. Now, to add insult to injury, this riot and other anti-Chinese incidents would be cited as reasons for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It was a classic example of blaming the victim for their victimization. Senator George Frisbee Hoare, a Massachusetts Republican, said that the Chinese Exclusion Act amounted to legalized racial discrimination. The Chinese immigrants were excluded from the country until World War II, when the United States government decided it was lousy diplomacy to exclude the people from an allied nation of China and the United States were allies in the war against the Axis powers of the German Nazis, Italian fascists, and the Japanese imperialists. So in 1943, Congress repealed the Chinese Act and the 63 years of exclusion. It allowed the Chinese the right to become naturalized citizens and permitted 105 to enter the country. 105, that is fewer people than are typically enrolled in my introduction Chinese history class. As this a quote from John Hyam, who wrote Strangers in the Land, a very famous book on American nativism. It says, "The Chinese must go," a slogan that was popular at the time, right? You may be familiar with the expression, "the Utes must go." The idea is, of course, that they should be eliminated from the land. As the quote goes, "No variety of anti-European sentiment ever approached the violent extremes to which anti-Chinese agitation went in the 1870s and 1880s. Lynching, boycotts, and mass expulsions still harassed the Chinese after the federal government yielded to the clamor for their exclusion in 1882. So this problem was manifest during this earlier period. And even after they had summarily excluded them from the country, they continued to be, lynched, boycotted, and expelled and harassed. 3 years after the exclusion of the Chinese was the infamous Rock Springs Massacre in 1885, where 28 Chinese were killed and 15 were wounded. Asians in America experienced a pattern that involved their eventual exclusion from the country and their replacement by another group of Asian workers. So following the exclusion of the Chinese in 1882, they would be replaced by Chinese workers because there was a chronic shortage of workers in the American West. Do remember that where we currently live today was originally considered part of the Great American Desert. And who, of course, in their right mind, moves to a desert, right? So they had a difficult time in attracting workers to the area. Immigrant workers of various sorts. The Chinese, the Japanese, and others came because there was a need for workers and they could find the work necessary to support their families, right? In any case, the Japanese workers began arriving in Colorado toward the end of the Gilded Age, that is the late 19th century, approximately from the 1870s to about 1900. And mid-1890s, because of the chronic need for these laborers in, once again, what Stephen Long called the Great American Desert. This is a slide of Japanese agricultural workers. The Japanese worked mainly in the agricultural sector as farmers who provided the food necessary to sustain the population. They also worked as migrant laborers in the beet fields as seasonal workers. As you know, sugar beets was a major agricultural product and was called white gold. Like the Chinese, they too suffered from harassment, violence, and exclusion. The Japanese would also be excluded from entering America, beginning with the secret Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. This particular agreement was made between the United States and the Japanese government. The United States, because Japan was a growing power, allowed the Japanese to keep their people from immigrating from Japan, rather than suffer the embarrassment of being excluded from America. When the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the US entered World War II against the Axis powers that I've already mentioned, militaristic Japan, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, the Japanese Americans were treated as a de facto enemy alien, basically they were treated as fifth columnists. As you can see from this Dr. Seuss cartoon, they are represented as well, individuals who all looked alike, who were prepared to engage in sabotage of fifth column. The General John L. DeWitt, who was in charge of the Western Defense Command, said something that was rather ironic. There's a lot of ironies in Asian American Pacific Island history. Quote, "The fact that we have not even sporadic attempts at sabotage clearly means that the control is being exercised somewhere." So they didn't engage in all the things that they were alleged to be doing, that is spying and engaging in acts of sabotage. And for that reason, they were even condemned even more for it. They tried to declare that they were American, but to little avail. They put up signs, as you can see here, I am an American, But as far as General DeWitt was concerned, as well as a large number of fellow Americans, a Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not. And because of that fact, the Japanese Americans and the Japanese on the West Coast would be forced to evacuate, and would be imprisoned in concentration camps. There were 10 major concentration camps in the United States. About 120,000 West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans were forced to basically abandon everything they owned and were transported to one of these concentration camps, which were located in the most remote and desolate places in America. And they were only allowed to take what they could carry, which was not much. To try to understand what this means is you basically have to imagine if this was happening to you. In other words, you would be basically asked to take, what you could carry and abandon everything that you own. That included, of course, your jobs, your homes, your cars, your furniture, everything, and go to one of these concentration camps. It is easy to understand why this Japanese American girl looks bewildered. I would be too if I left behind everything I knew to be imprisoned in a concentration camp. There were 10 of these camps, as you can see from this map. There were Tule Lake, Manzanar, Boston, Gila River, Minidoka, Heart Mountain, Topaz, Jerome, and Roa, and there was one in Colorado, located, as you can see, in the southeastern part of the state near the Kansas border. This camp was later called Camp Amachi. The Amachi concentration camp in the southeastern part of the state near the Kansas border housed over 7,000 people of Japanese ancestry. And as you can see from this picture, what Amachi looked like was essentially, a camp consisting of flimsy barracks. And it was surrounded by barbed wire with gun towers. When this was happening, there was one notable Coloradan who was willing to stand up for the rights of Japanese Americans, and that was Governor Ralph Carr. Now, he was an authentic profile in courage and had welcomed the Japanese Americans to the state when other Western state governors would not. There was a good reason why the Denver Post named him Colorado's person of the century. Now, many young Japanese Americans enlisted in the United States Armed Forces, despite their families being imprisoned in concentration camps. During World War II, they, like other people of color, bore the dual burdens of fighting racism at home and the Axis enemy abroad. Most of them were members of the segregated a Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. By the end of the war, the 442nd became the most decorated military unit for its size and duration of service in American history. 22 Japanese Americans, including 2 Japanese Coloradans, Kiyoshi Morinaga, you can see the sketch of him here, and Joe Sakato, won the Congressional Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry at the risk of their lives above and beyond the call of duty. With the end of the war, the federal government closed the concentration camps. The forced evacuation of Japanese and Japanese Americans from America's West Coast and their imprisonment in concentration camps was one of the worst mass violations of citizens' civil liberties in North America. As Roger Daniels explained, this violation was due to race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. As this recent cartoon indicates, some Americans did learn from the government's misguided policy of imprisoning Japanese Americans in concentration camps. In the aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy, some of our political leaders actually stepped up to say, hey, let us not take this out on our fellow Muslim Americans. And they obviously had learned from the Japanese American experience. In fact, they said as much. They said, we shouldn't commit the same mistake we did with the Japanese Americans by mistreating the Muslim Americans among us. And this cartoon, which I cut out from the paper recently, indicates that it's managed to make it into the popular consciousness as well. Now, I want to end my presentation with a brief note about today's Asian Coloradans. There are several differences from the earlier period. They are a much more diverse group. 13 different Asian and Pacific Islander ethnic groups in Denver, not just Chinese and Japanese. The 6 most prominent are Chinese, Asian Indian, Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Japanese. The Chinese are the largest, and the Japanese are the smallest. They are no longer restricted to low wage and physically demanding jobs, but occupy many occupations. They are essential to the state's information technology economy. They live throughout the state and are no longer forced to live in ethnic enclaves or ethnic communities. They are also able to raise families. They belong to the fastest growing immigrant group in the country. They continued, however, to suffer from the problems that I've been discussing today. They are still stereotyped. But ironically, one of them is being a model minority. I trust everyone realizes that when we talk about a stereotype, we're talking about a particular type of mindset, which attributes one characteristic to an entire group of people. When, like any group of people, there should be a diversity of types within it, right? In any case, today they are stereotyped as a model minority. What does that mean? That as a model minority, they're viewed as a group, ironically, to be emulated rather than despised. Now think about that. In the 19th century, when they first arrived in the United States in large numbers, they were held in contempt and considered inferior people, right? They were viewed as members of criminal elements. They were viewed as disease carriers. And now they're viewed as a model minority, a model ethnic group, a model immigrant group. And the reason why this particular stereotype was invoked was so that people could make, well, quite frankly, invidious comparisons with other minority groups or other people of color. Basically what they're saying is, look what we did to them, right? We've harassed them, we've discriminated against them, we've committed violence against them. And yet You know, they not only survived being a resilient people, but they have also prospered and have done well. They've done very well according to the stereotype. The problem, of course, is it's a stereotype, you know, and it's misleading. Certainly, there have been Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who have done well. You know? But what we have here is a bipolar distribution in which you have some who have done well and others who have not. There are great discrepancies in income and education. Whenever you see this, you have to look at the data and disaggregate it, and you can see this bipolar distribution and ask yourself, well, why are they emphasizing them as a model minority? It's because it serves as a racial wedge issue. Because what they're saying, in effect, is that if you're not doing well in America, it's your fault. It's because you suffer from some sort of racial or cultural deficiency, and rather than the problem of systemic racism, which is a problem. Now, I'm following the advice of one of my colleagues on the State Historians Council, Tom Noel, who has repeatedly reminded me, William, you gotta do more about promoting yourself. So I'm going to do that right now. If you're interested in learning more about what I've been talking about, may I recommend this book that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. This is my book, Asians in Colorado, A History of Persecution and Perseverance in the Centennial State. And I want to thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Wei. There was so much history that you covered that I wasn't even aware of that AAPI communities had contributed to in Colorado. So just want to remind our participants on the call today that you can ask your questions in two ways. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen that you can type your questions in, or if you want to put them in chat, they should come to us as well. And a question that came up for me, Dr. Wei, in your presentation and thinking through all of these spaces that AAPIs had engaged in labor and mistreatment, I didn't necessarily hear like an uprising or like a pivotal moment that we hear about with other communities. Like in LGBTQ, we talk about the Stonewall riots, where there was this like push for justice. Does anything like that exist within Colorado history or AAPI history? And if not, what do you think contributes to that?
Well, yes. Well, there are a number of reasons why they haven't necessarily engaged in the kind of a mass protest that you've been describing. There have, however, been moments, when the community has been outraged and have engaged in demonstrations. One of the earliest examples was in 1982 with the killing of Vincent Chin. Some of you may know about this tragedy. Vincent Chin was a young man who was out with his friends celebrating his impending marriage. He was a Chinese American. A couple of unemployed Detroit workers mistook him for a Japanese, and they got into an altercation. They blamed them basically for their unemployment. And after the altercation, they went out looking for him with baseball bats, and they bludgeoned him to death. This really outraged the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and they protested his killing, as well as the subsequent trial in which the perpetrators of the crime were basically received very minimal punishment. They basically paid a fine. One of them didn't even pay the fine; they basically fled, and people were outraged, therefore, by the crime and the punishment. They thought this was an injustice, and I think most people will agree it was an injustice. But it does show that the problem of being forever foreign in your own country and being taken at face value. That is, if you're Asian, it doesn't matter, what kind of Asian. As far as they're concerned, one Asian is like any other Asian, and is singled out for blame for whatever problems that they may be personally experiencing or the country is experiencing. He's a young man, and his life was tragically cut short. And more recently, the incidence of anti-Asian hate crimes has moved the Asian American Pacific Islander community to protest it as well. So they've engaged in, protest events, and have certainly gained the attention of the federal government. As I mentioned early on, Congress did pass, an anti-hate crime legislation, which President Biden signed, right, a year ago, and more recently, the Justice Department has been trying to act on it. So there has been, but not at the same level as you've seen other groups, most notably among the African Americans in the United States. And there are a number of reasons why it hasn't attained the same level of intensity, in part also due to the numbers. They're very, relatively few, in part because they kept us out of the country, kept the numbers artificially small, right? They may be one of the fastest growing immigrant groups today, but given their small numbers, the absolute numbers is very small. At most, they constitute about 6% of the population, which is markedly small, and they are dispersed throughout the country. Although you'll find clusters of them, especially on the West Coast and on the East Coast. So it hasn't reached the same level. And another thing to keep in mind is that the majority of them today are from they're immigrants, and like other immigrants, their main preoccupation is with supporting their family, and they're not quite certain what their status is in the United States as immigrants, and they also have a healthy skepticism about the government and whether protesting is going to yield any positive results. I'm sorry, that's a rather long-winded answer to your question. I tend to do that a lot in things, especially in class.
That was very thoughtful and comprehensive, and thank you for sharing that story as well. I do see a question in the chat here, taking us back even further in history. Can you tell us about what events transpired before the 1881 riot?
I'm sorry, what events transpired before the
1881 riot?
Oh, well, actually, I may have misspoken if I said 1881 and things, because it actually occurred in October 31st, 1880. So it was the anti-Chinese riot in Denver in 1880. And as my book indicates, there were anti-Chinese and more broadly anti-Asian riots throughout the states. They began with anti-Chinese incidents in various mining camps. One of the things they took exception to was the presence of Chinese miners who were engaged in placer mining, a very labor-intensive kind of mining, and they were able to actually make a living and support their families from doing this. When the country, or rather when this territory, then the state, experienced, if you will, economic difficulties, as we often did during those days, we experienced practically every decade a recession. Whenever we experienced one of those, they needed to blame somebody for the problem. And it was easiest to blame the most vulnerable peoples in your population, especially those you could readily identify, like the Chinese. And so they experienced these incidents. A year before the 1880 anti-Chinese riot, there was a famous so-called Italian-Chinese war in the city of Como, which is located down near South Park, in which the Italian workers tried to expel the Chinese workers from the area because they were fearful that the importation of Chinese workers would undercut their wages. And therefore, they sought to expel the Chinese workers. So there were large numbers of incidents that occurred in the territory and then in the state in various places. And this would also happen to the Japanese. Back in those days, the Chinese and the Japanese did not work together in the face of racism that confronted both of them, and things. And that has changed. These days, Asian American Pacific Islanders realize that they have, in many ways, a shared history as well as a shared future because of the way they are perceived. But one of the things I often like to point out is that, well, unlike, like other people of color, we're easily identifiable in the population, easy to single out, and therefore easy to discriminate against. And this problem has been overcome by white ethnic groups through the issue of intermarriage. They are not so easy to identify, and once they intermarried with members of the mainstream, they no longer were seen as an ethnic group, and their personal identity was no longer of much concern, because in fact, if you're 1/8 something else, your personal identity becomes basically your national identity. And this is markedly different for people of color, who are often identified by virtue of their race or ethnicity.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wei. I've got a question in the chat here, related to your comment about this idea that Asian Americans are seen as the perpetual foreigner. What are the strengths and the limitations of celebrating AAPI month as this monolith, then, of just rolling all of these unique identities together?
Yes, right. Thank you very much for bringing that up. Let me first of all point out that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders often have problems with that as well, because they don't want to necessarily be perceived as a monolithic group, because they recognize there's a great deal of diversity within it, right? I mean, there are 50 different ethnic groups coming from 40 different countries. They speak as many as 100 different languages, so lumping them all together, seems counter to the reality of who they actually are, right? But for political reasons, where numbers count, you need to collaborate, to cooperate, if you're going to make any headway in dealing with these issues that challenge them. You're not going to get very far as an individual ethnic group. You have to do it, quite frankly, in solidarity with others, since you share the same problem. And that's one reason why it should be done that way. And then, of course, having a month devoted to them, well, quite frankly, that's better than nothing, right? It's better than nothing. It'd be great if we had a month for every group, but I don't think that's about to happen anytime soon, right? And things. So they're both, strengths and weaknesses. And by just having the month, this AAPI Heritage Month, at least gives you an opportunity to discuss the very issue of the diversity within the AAPI community. you can say, hey, there's actually more diversity than that name suggests. Although I understand why that might reinforce the assumption that, well, they all look alike, they're all the same, when in fact they're not.
Thank you for that, Dr. Way. Another question in the chat here: what resources does Colorado have to support those people who have been attacked or biased as a result of the recent developments, maybe around COVID-19? Are those resources available and accessible to people in languages that they are most comfortable in?
Yes. Well, I think things have improved, perhaps not as much as we'd like, but certainly there's been, advances since when, well, there've been advances over the decades, and things locally. There's we have organizations, who are prepared to deal with some of these issues, like the Asian Development Center. And the Asian Development Center, has, personnel who speak different languages and sensitive different cultures, who can provide support. The legal system, our judicial system, recognizes that the people who go through the legal process, need to have people who can speak their languages. So there are provisions for that. One of the things that the Asian American Pacific Islander community itself has to do is be willing to report, these incidents when they occur. There is a natural reluctance. I mean, it's not unique to them, right? People are not necessarily anxious to talk about their victimization. But the only way to make this known is they have to step forward to do it. And hopefully that they will receive attention and maybe redress for the grievances that they have. But it is a real challenge for them. But things are much better now than they used to be. When I first started coming to terms with all of this as a young man many decades ago, we didn't even have Asian American studies, and there was very little information about Asian American Pacific Islander history and culture. Back in those days, people used to say, well, what are you, William? Chinese or American? And quite frankly, that's a false dichotomy, because you're really an Asian American with your own history and culture. And that history and culture has been documented now since the 60s. So now there are many more studies about this, and you can actually learn about your history and culture, rather than identifying with an Asian culture with which you have little experience, or trying to be part of an American culture that rejects you, right? When in fact you have an Asian American Pacific Islander history and culture that you can in fact learn about. And that will therefore hopefully resolve any identity conflicts that you might be having. When people, unintentionally force this dichotomy on you and say, well, what are you? Are you Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, or are you an American? Ideally, you should be able to say, I'm just an American like the rest of you, but that's not the way you're being perceived, right? They always see you as somehow being different. And that's one step to being called, well, foreign, that you're not really part of the country.
And I so appreciate this history and all of the things that you covered today. And I think a question that's come up a couple of times here, holding that history in tension and then wanting to leave this presentation with action. What are some of the actionable steps we can take to support the AAPI community today?
Yes. Well, since you're all members of the Denver Health, I think one of the most immediate things you can do is support your Asian American Pacific Islander colleagues. as I mentioned at the head of this presentation, 10% of the health workers, be they doctors, physicians, nurses, surgeons, they're Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and recognize that they are, having to cope with this problem of anti-Asian hate, that they have to go forward and do their work, right, on behalf of everybody in the nation. Recognizing that they're suffering from this, I think is a very first good step, in dealing with the problem that's quite frankly immediate. They may be experiencing these difficulties. They don't necessarily go out and tell you, hey, look at the problems I'm experiencing. And if they're experiencing these problems, they may be, responding in a variety of ways that may be inexplicable to everyone else. Like they're having a bad day because some moron has been engaged in microaggressions against them, who maybe have in fact, physically assaulted them, called them names, thrown things at them, and things that their colleagues haven't themselves experienced, and things. So I think that would be one good start. And of course, being an educator, I think it's important to educate others, because at the end of the day, I think education is perhaps the only real solution to these problems. And this education has to begin at the home, right? At home, as well as in the schools. You educate them about Asian Americans, and you learn about their history and culture. But you don't talk about, China and assume that tells you something about the Chinese in America, right? And things. And that's not done very much. We have a bill that was passed in the Colorado legislature, 1192, and that created a commission, which then came up with recommendations, basically telling the schools to teach more about the various ethnic and racial groups in Colorado. And that's helpful too, but they've been experiencing pushback. As you know, recently in the United States, there's been a lot of controversies over things like CRT, critical race theory, which is patently ridiculous. And CRT, to the extent that it's taught at all, is done in law schools and at the graduate school level. But they use that as a euphemism for talking about the history and culture of people of color, including Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And what these people are pushing back on is they don't want the young ones to learn about this because, they're afraid that their young ones are going to be hurt, as if learning about them will make them feel guilty about what their ancestors have done to people of color. That's a real problem. Basically, they're depriving their kids of complete understanding of American history and culture. You can't change the history and culture unless you know about it and understand it. And that includes the ugly parts. Look, we actually live in a great country. What makes us a great country, what makes us, quite frankly, an exceptional country, is our commitment to certain ideals. And those ideals, which are reflected in our founding documents, are things like racial equality, social justice, and political empowerment. And over time, we work to try to achieve them. And admittedly, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, right? But we have made advances. Recently, we had a celebration over women's suffrage, political empowerment. This is good, right? When we had the civil rights movement, people, what were they asking for? They were asking not for more rights, they were asking for equal rights. They wanted the same rights as others. Yeah. And people, I travel a lot. Trust me when I tell you, people are always amazed at the United States, and the fact that we have these ideals and we strive to realize them. That's what makes us exceptional. You know what makes us an American? It's our commitment to those ideals. It's our commitment to those ideals, of racial equality, social justice, and political empowerment. That's what truly makes us American. I think not what the white supremacists would argue. For them, what makes us American is being white. And what they don't realize is that once upon a time, white meant a certain subsegment of the white population, because there were white groups who were viewed as whites. Well, actually, they weren't viewed as whites, were excluded from the country, which is why we had quotas in the 1920s against certain white ethnic groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. They weren't necessarily considered whites, until they were stood up in contrast to people of color. So, oh yeah, at least compared to them, you're white folks and things. And that's a definition that they use. If they knew their own history, they would realize that at one point, they too were excluded from the country. I'm sorry, that's once again a rather long explanation. I'm sorry.
It's very comprehensive, and I appreciate that. So one last question for you, Dr. Way. Can you remind us of the name of your book? We have some folks in the chat that are interested in picking up a copy.
Oh, yes. Thank you. It's called Asians in Colorado, A History of Persecution and Perseverance in the Centennial State. It was published by the University of Washington Press in 2016. And thank you for asking about it. Actually, I think the book's not bad, actually. All things considered, I've written several of these, it's not too bad, I'd like to think I tell a good story, and it's an American story I'm telling, and can't avoid the history of persecution, but the emphasis, this also is on perseverance, because the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders I talk about, had what we in the American West consider to be a real important virtue, and that's called true grit, right? They had true grit, and they carried on in spite of all of these problems, and they did it for the reasons that we can all understand. They did it to support their families.
Dr. Way, that seems like a nice note for us to end on. We're coming up on the hour here. So again, we are so thankful for you sharing your time and your talent with us today and giving us that comprehensive history so we can understand all of the events in the past and, as you mentioned, make good decisions moving forward based on that well-informed history. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And friends on the call, if you have colleagues who weren't able to join us today, we'll be sharing information about the recording and how you can access that, as well as the information about Dr. Way's book. So thank you so much for